Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth 911 podcast. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we are really fortunate today to be joined by Adam Sachs, who's the Executive Director for the Boston area-based Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. Adam and I met through a regular conversation of global climate experts, and he is an passionate advocate of the use of land management, reclaiming land in order to sequester carbon. But he's been involved in this research for the past 15 to 20 years, building some of the most influential repositories of information about eco-restoration that are available. And you can see those at bio4, that's the number 4, climate.org, and look for the compendiums. They're wonderful resources to dig into. He also is the author of an article on grist.com from 2009 called We Have Met the Deniers and They Are Us. And this was an article actually directed to the scientific community that was discussing various technological solutions. And let me just read a brief passage before we start the conversation. What is the reality we're denying? We're denying that we put so much carbon into the atmosphere already that positive feedback loops are well on their way to amplification hell. We're denying that time lags between carbon emissions and their effects are frighteningly relevant, and that the disastrous effects we're seeing now are from emissions 30 years ago. We're denying the nonlinear responses of physical systems cannot be calculated and therefore perilously ignored. We're denying that our consumption and waste have far exceeded planetary capacity, possibly irreparably so. And he goes on to say it's largely a function of the fact that all of us are very comfortable and don't want to change. So Adam, welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. Tell us how you got started with this and how it transformed your perspective and made a mission of your life to change the climate.
Well, thank you, Mitch. I started learning about climate around 1998, 1999. I was actually working for Sun Microsystems. I was in the belly of the technological beast, and I started gathering information about climate and sharing it with my colleagues, and got all kinds of pushback from people who were very comfortable in their cubes with their computers and keyboards. And I thought this was rather strange, since even in 1999, there was some pretty good information out there. And in fact, in subsequent investigations or research, there is a video clip from a Bell Telephone Hour show in 1958, and the clip has about 5 minutes worth of how serious global warming could be eventually meaning a couple of 100 years, who knows.
Sure.
So
I remember when we thought it was way out there.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago that we thought that. And so I climbed on board the climate activism train and went to all kinds of rallies and signed petitions and advocated for alternative electricity and all kinds of other energy-saving things. And I did that for 7 or 8 years. And I began to notice that the carbon burden in the atmosphere kept going up. It wasn't going down despite all that we were doing. And people would say, well, the technology is not yet advanced enough. The fossil fuel companies are evil SOBs, and the government has whatever, George Bush at that time. But I was feeling pretty discouraged. So I pulled out of active involvement in the climate movement. And I started doing just a lot of reading of, Tim Flannery kind of stuff, and anthropology, because I was really curious about how it is that we're making these decisions. Why are we behaving this way? And some studies in history. And I met a friend who's a biologist who is very, he's very creative and curious and not constrained by the scientific norms strictly. And he introduced me to our first piece of the land management picture, which was with Alan Savory's work on grassland restoration using grazing animals, which of course went against all the popular thinking about how bad cows are for the planet, and our industrial agriculture is ruining everything, which is true. But managing animals on pastures by grazing the way nature does it is a completely different story. I mean, you can use a hammer to build a house, or you can use a hammer to kill people. And the way we conventionally graze animals, and they are fed into the factory farming system, is the killing side. But if you manage them in tight herds and move them on a constant basis, that is the productivity side, because nature evolved over 50 million years with grasslands and grazing animals working together.
Right.
And if you take either one away from the other, they die. So obviously you don't feed the animals their grass, they die. But if you take the animals off the grasslands, the grasses die, because the grasses evolved to being bitten. The grasslands evolved to getting the constant opening up of the soil so that they could absorb water, and to the re-nourishing of the soils with the dung and urine and saliva. And so that complicated ecological process, when intact, is of great benefit. And there used to be countless millions of grazing animals, and the carbon levels were below 280 at those times. And
so they were just dispersed differently.
They behaved very differently.
Yes.
When you fence them in, even if it's a large tract of 1,000 acres, they behave just really contrary to what nature would like. So that was the first piece I started learning about. And of course, when grasslands thrive, carbon is captured. Every green growing thing that you see is carbon that used to be in the atmosphere. Now, some of that cycles back up with the seasons, but some of it goes into the soils and into the root systems and into the incredible variety of life that's in the soils that we're just beginning to understand. Until the last few years, we had very little understanding of the interactions among animals and plants and insects and microbes, and how they really formed a living system that was interreliant.
So now you've been working to drive projects to reclaim, for instance, desertified farmland and so forth. How does your group, your organization, work to encourage the reclamation of those kinds of lands?
We ourselves do not do any land management. We are an educational and promotional and activist organization. We've had 11 conferences since November 2014, which was our first. We've got about 200 videos of speakers discussing their eco-restoration projects and scientists who talk about the principles behind it. And they're all available on YouTube. They've got over 110,000 views now, which isn't much compared to Beyonce, but it's still, for an eco-restoration video set, it's doing pretty well. And we also reach out to other organizations, including climate organizations, and say, hey, you're talking about emissions reduction, and that's important, but it's pretty well accepted at this point that emissions reductions by themselves, even if we go to zero tomorrow, will not be adequate to address the climate in ways that we need. So we need to talk about pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into the ground, but even more importantly, talk about the loss of biodiversity and the loss of billions, literally billions of acres of land from active photosynthesis, not bringing down carbon, the loss of those lands as a result of human mismanagement of the landscape. So our work is to bring that message to other organizations so they can incorporate it into their own, and we kind of evolve into a bigger megaphone. And,
go ahead.
And get the message coming from lots of different points rather than just from us and a few other organizations that are doing this.
Well, and we've spoken before about the fact that really a lot of people are just waking up to the impacts. They are undeniable. For instance, I'm speaking to you in the midst of what is being called in the Northwest a smoke storm. And we're being told that smoke storms will be a regular part of our lives because of the massively increased wildfires. Now that people are starting to really have to acknowledge this, they can see it and feel it in their daily life. How much of that land that has gone to waste can we recapture? Can we recapture all of it? I know there's financial and other limitations, but could we theoretically capture all that and bring it back to productivity?
I think we can. And where the perspective I come from is that for us as an organization, we address possibilities. So if you look at pretty much mainstream science, or even kind of a bit out of the center of mainstream science, and look at estimations of what soils can hold, you come up with a very conservative picture. So there was an article in Nature not too long ago that was put together by some scientists from the Nature Conservancy, and they estimated something like if we did all this restoration, we could capture about 35% of our annual emissions.
Okay.
Well, at this point in time, that's not going to do us that much good.
Right.
And there's a permaculturist named Eric Tonesmeyer who also did research on that. And he's a very smart guy and very talented permaculturist. But he came up with similar numbers. Now, the reason that they came up with those numbers is that they consulted the pretty much mainstream soil science literature, which has based most of its studies on agricultural land, and agricultural land that has been treated by and large the way we do now, with pesticides and fertilizers and tilling
every year, not allowing the biological processes to continue on. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the whole picture is skewed by that. And I'm not blaming anybody here. It's no one's fault. I mean, some of these scientists did a great job. But the position we take is we look at possibilities, at positive variants that can show us where we can go, even if we're not going there very much now. So we are going there now on maybe a few million acres around the world, but it needs to be in the billions.
Can you give us an example of some of those few million acres that you are aware of right now being recaptured?
So just a brief review of the scary stuff. If I can get the... There we go. So this is the growth rate of carbon in the atmosphere. It's just accelerating per year. It's overall accelerating, not necessarily from one year to the next, but over a period of years. And this is the warming still to come. And we were talking before about we see the smoke as normal. And so when we look at this graph, we don't actually see in our minds that that big black line shooting straight up. What we see is where we are now.
And just so that for the viewers who may not be able to see the detail in this image, so what we're talking about in this screen is the 1 degree temperature change is the scale on the left, on the vertical, from -2 degrees to 5 degrees Celsius. And we are currently at 1.5 or so.
We're at 1.
We're
around 1, which is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right. And so much of what is projected on that hockey stick line, we already know is going to happen.
Yeah. Quite enough has already happened.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to come.
Right.
So one of the things is, that we don't want to contemplate, and this is me when I was 5 years old, and the extinction I'm imposing on my 5-year-old self was, of course, nuclear war.
Yep.
And the feeling for children today is very similar to what I was feeling back almost 70 years ago. And people are starting to talk about extinction more and more. So we're starting to get an idea of what we're facing. So here's one report from last year that talks about the East Pacific, and comes out of Australia. And these two authors, Ian Dunlop and David Spratt, also published a report this year called "What Lies Beneath," which is a very frank and an excellent review of the kinds of things we've done and why we've done them and why they haven't worked and what we might do. Yep. Another disaster-oriented article on Inhabited Earth from New York Magazine a year ago. And so now what do we do? The reframing of the problem that we offer is the power of the natural world. So here's what used to be a tree of life and now is a conversion of various life paths since a remarkable microbiologist named Lynn Margulis kind of changed the story of evolution. But it all goes back to the bacteria. They invented before there was ever any other creature, be it a plant or even fungi. They invented all the chemical processes that are used by creatures today.
Yep.
And here's what would happen if there was no life on Earth. Earth would look just like Mercury pretty much, because it's life that keeps those clouds swirling and the oceans moving and even perhaps keeps the water on Earth.
It's interesting. You're pointing out something. A lot of people look at the picture of the Earth and they think, well, there's the atmosphere. The atmosphere has always been there. But no, the bacteria made the atmosphere.
That's right. The aerobic bacteria is one of the great extinctions in Earth's history about 2.5 billion years ago, where the aerobic bacteria started pumping all this very, very powerful and toxic gas out called oxygen. And anaerobic bacteria had no biochemical mechanisms for dealing with oxygen's toxicity. Of course, we have all kinds of mechanisms in our bodies, as does just about every living creature on Earth at this point. There's certainly plenty of anaerobic creatures left, but the aerobes have pretty much taken over. So this is a picture of minerals, and there are about 1,500 natural mineral forms like quartz and jade and stuff like that. And on Earth, there are over 5,000. And the reason there are so many more on Earth than elsewhere is because of living things, because of the biochemical interactions when microbes start to attack rocks because they need the nutrients that are in the rocks. They combine things in all kinds of new ways and create these remarkable patterns.
Life has been busy.
Yes, life has been very busy, and it works for free. Of course, it mostly needs sunlight, but that's, for all intents and purposes, free on Earth so far. This is a photo of those bacteria you were talking about that gave us an oxygen atmosphere. And they also create what are called microbial mats, which are these literal mats that hold all kinds of things together. They create, you can see here in Yellowstone, they're creating new land out of rock and soil and water and light. And here's what some of them look like. It's a huge, huge range of shapes and sizes and
in many of these cases, our bodies actually have incorporated these things over the course of time too.
That's right. I mean, when I was growing up in the 50s, the only good microbe was a dead microbe, and now we learn that our microbiomes in our guts are affecting our neural systems, our immune systems, our brains. There are more microbial cells in our bodies by a factor of 10 than there are so-called human cells. And even the human cells have ancient microbial parts in them, like mitochondria, which are the energy machines of the cell. So our history goes all the way back to the beginning of life. And life has created all of that. Here's a phytoplankton, a plant that floats around in the ocean and creates these remarkable calcium kind of shells for protection. And when they die, they sink to the bottom. Here's a view of a bloom of them. They're called Emiliana Huxley. There's a bloom of them on the coast of England, around 10,000 kilometers square, and then they sink, and then eventually there is Earth tectonic uplift, and you get things like the cliffs of Dover. All that's limestone, and it's all from those former life forms. And
that is also sequestered carbon.
That is also sequestered carbon. And this is a picture of chloroplasts, the energy and oxygen transformation cells in plants. And all those little green things used to be those free-living cyanobacteria. Yep. The bacteria and some other cells got together and discovered that there was a positive and mutually helpful relationship. So they joined up and have been in company for over a couple of billion years. And that, of course, is our oxygen atmosphere, which is all a gift of these photosynthesizing bacteria. So how can we heal this dilemma that we've created? Well, as we talked about the grazing animals before, we can restore billions of acres of desertified grasslands. And the cows are essential to that, as are other animals. But in this case, they are a keystone species. We can also restore billions of acres or millions of acres of wetlands. And beavers are key in doing that. They need deep water ponds in order to survive. And they create them where there's sometimes very little water at all. And those ponds and streams sequester a lot of carbon. There's muck that goes to the bottom and is in an anaerobic condition and does not oxidize the plant cells and put the carbon back in the atmosphere. It keeps them there in a much more stable form. And finally, there are earthworms who open up the soils and stir them around and create castings that they bring to the surface that are very fertile.
Mm-hmm.
So here's our first example in Košice, Slovakia. You can see a severely eroded field.
Right.
And after 9 months of good management, you get this. So you have plants growing where there were just ruts and even sprouts of dog. How does this happen? Well, a little tool called check dams, and this is also from Slovakia. A hydrologist named Michael Kravchuk has all kinds of innovative ideas about managing water cycles. But
these are almost beaver-like dams.
Exactly. They are. They're human-made beaver dams. And what they do, you can see in the upper left, the silt is starting to accumulate upstream of the dam, and then downstream of the dam, you can see how the water is continuing to flow. And those are actually not streams. Those are logging roads and erosion gullies that were formed after years of use of the logging roads. So on the picture on the right, you can see the silt having accumulated and all of the green plants that are starting to grow and recreate a forest. So we know how to do this. We know how to do all of this. There's always more to learn, but we've got what we need to get started. And the results.
And so it's clear that we can do remarkable things, and that this. So would you consider reclamation of desert and other ruined environments part of a toolkit, or the whole toolkit that we need in order to solve our carbon problem?
I think that it could be the whole toolkit if it comes to that. I think emissions reductions is also a piece of the toolkit. As for direct air capture, I have serious questions about that, which we can talk about a little bit later.
Sure.
When I hypothesize about this, I think of it as having to do the whole job. And I ask myself, can it? And let's move on and we'll talk about more of that. Here's an example in Mexico. The arrow is pointing to a tree that it will point to in the next picture. And similar human beaver activity is at work. And after 2 years, it turned into that.
Wow.
Here is an example in Zimbabwe. This land that you see has been overgrazed for decades and is just bare and barely alive.
In this case, to go back to something we said earlier, overgrazed in the sense that they kept the animals in a too restricted space.
Right, exactly. And you follow the red oval, and you can see that same tree after 3 years of good grazing management.
That's incredible.
It is, and you know what? When you've been around these things for a while, it doesn't become less incredible, but it becomes, of course, it's less of a surprise because, yes, nature does this. Nature has been doing this for billions of years. Why don't we just help nature along? Now, if we were to disappear and leave nature to its own devices, eventually a lot of this stuff would turn into abundance again. I won't say it would be restored because the earth is like a moving river. It's never the same place twice. Mm-hmm. But it can do amazing things, whether you want to call it restoration or not. We tend to call it regenerative land management these days, bringing it back to health, but it doesn't necessarily look exactly the way it did.
Well, because humans are involved and still involved. Yeah.
That's right. And we can put pieces in place that would take nature 100 or 200 or 500 years to do. We can put those missing pieces in place. It doesn't have to happen randomly. And it can happen in 2 or 3 years because it's those keystone species. It's those parts that are essential to the process that we intentionally bring back and that contribute to the acceleration of the regeneration. So here's an example of a rancher in Mexico, in northern Mexico, who needed more water for his cattle. So conventional reasoning is, well, you want to capture all the rain that you can, so you dig a big hole so the rain flows into it down the hill and from the sky. And so you get this pond that cattle can water themselves at, but it doesn't do much else. And this rancher learned about Alan Savory's holistic plant grazing and decided he would give it a try. And because there's so little rain, and a lot of the speed of a regeneration depends on rainfall, because there was so little rain, it took 25 years for the regeneration to flourish in this particular location. But flourish it did. That's
Wow.
The same land, and it probably is holding 6 times as much water, and of course brings with it all kinds of other ecological benefits with grasses and forbs and trees and shrubs and all kinds of biodiversity. So here's a surprise quiz for you, Mitch.
Okay.
That I used to live there, and that was the front yard. And it was a 90-degree day, and I took my kitchen thermometer and measured the temperature from under the bushes across the yard onto the asphalt. And so the question is, what do you think is the difference in temperature in degrees Fahrenheit between the warmest and the coolest spot in this picture?
So I'm going to guess that the temperature under the plants is the normal soil temperature generally, which is about 55 degrees, and that the pavement is probably between 95 and 105 degrees. So let's say up between 40 and 50 degrees.
You're the first person who has, at least out loud, reasoned it that well. And the actual difference in temperature between under the bushes and the asphalt was 60 degrees. It was 68 under the bushes, and it was 128 on the asphalt, because the asphalt is a kind of a poor cousin of a black body. So it retains a lot of heat. Sure. But the point is that what we're seeing is the difference in shade, which helps retain water, and green plants, which cool the area where they are, and what is a virtual desert, which is the road surface.
Yeah.
So the important thing about this is that we can indeed cool the biosphere, even with elevated greenhouse gases. And the cooling of the biosphere will also help bring the greenhouse gases down, because it makes a more hospitable environment for more things to grow. So here's another example that was brought to us by a man named Rajendra Singh, who's known as the Waterman of India. He spoke at our 2015 Restoring Water Conference. And he had studied Ayurvedic medicine and wanted to go out to the rural villages to help people with their health. And one day, one of the elders came to him and said, we really appreciate your medicine, but what we need more than anything else is water. Our young people are all leaving because the land is dry and they can't farm anymore. Yep. So he took that to heart, and for about a year, he built these little dams. They're kind of circular
He was beavering away too.
Well, it was a little different because it wasn't on existing water flows, but it was for capturing rain. Right. So they're kind of semicircular constructions of rock and mud that just, you put a lot of them out there and they start to capture the rain. And
again, that's incredible.
It is. And he did this in the driest province in India, Rajasthan. And over the years, he has helped 1,000 villages restore water to their area and actually brought back to life 7 rivers, 7 sizable rivers, and has an approach that people can replicate in many other places. So he started something. And again, another example in a very dry climate of this kind of regenerative land management. And I would add here that it's not all about agriculture. It's not all about human-centered. We rely on a web of life, of magnificent biodiversity, and we don't understand it. But if without this biodiversity, landscapes lose their resilience. They become much more susceptible to insult and eventually die. So we actually look at global warming as the root cause. I mean, the root cause of global warming being the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of billions of acres of land. Now, greenhouse gas emissions are certainly a problem. And they are heat trapping and they are very dangerous. But beneath that was the first use of the plow, where people were overturning soils and exposing the soils to the atmosphere, and the carbon molecules that are in the soils would be decomposed by microbes, and the carbon would go back into the atmosphere. And
but for that was sustainable when all we were doing was feeding ourselves.
So here's a point that I'd like to get back to later, if we can, and that is that that size matters. So if you were to do the most destructive, toxic thing imaginable on your 100 square foot plot of garden, the world would survive.
Right.
But if you start doing that on millions or billions of acres, it changes everything.
Yeah.
Processes that work on a small scale are entirely unpredictable, are completely changed when they go to a larger scale. And I've talked to engineers who don't really get that point.
But scaling as a concept is something, while it's several hundred years old in terms of understanding, has really only begun to be evident in daily life in technology. And the internet is an excellent example of this. The sudden connectivity over the course of a single generation of almost the entire planet. Yeah. Is an example of the kinds of scope that we're talking about happening in our environment that we're just beginning to see.
And I would add that the internet is a very, very fragile place. Yes, it wouldn't take much to crash it, either on a local or wider scale. And as it gets more complex, it gets more fragile, because complexity introduces all kinds of other points of failure that are possible.
Well, and so the other points of failure are not necessarily only technical; they are informational, which is another thing that we've seen as a result of the internet's propagation, is that a lot of false information, or at least contradictory information, which overwhelms truth. And truth being scientific in the sense that you can say, yeah, we can measure this.
Right. And of course, when you're on an unconnected computer, none of this complexity exists.
Right.
Or very little of it exists. So size matters. So when people come up with these technological solutions like direct air capture, and they prove the concept on a small scale, that says nothing about what's going to happen with that concept on a larger scale.
So you see that as a risk, is what I understand.
Well, it could be an opportunity loss risk. It could be an actual physical damage risk. It could be a resource extraction risk. I mean, there are a lot of risks there. So nature has worked out many of the risks that we face.
And well, you know, it had some time. We're still growing up.
That's right. And it's done a pretty good job. So when we do things like regenerate dead land, the risk is minimal compared to the technological risks. I wouldn't say that it's zero. We are always dealing with unintended consequences. And of course, that's a human concept. Nature has no unintended consequences. Nature is not concerned with outcomes. It's only concerned with process. And
it's a long experiment in living.
That's right. So here we are in Elko, Nevada. Nevada's the driest state in the country.
Yep.
And
I know this region well.
Okay. Well,
this is what it looked like when I used to live down there 30 years ago.
Well, you should visit the two people who have worked on this plot of land. There was a rancher named John Griggs who wanted more water and grass for his cattle, and a fisheries biologist who is with the Bureau of Land Management who wanted to bring the Lahontan trout back to the Great Basin. So the two of them worked together, and they made progress over the first 15 years or so. And then beavers showed up, and they accelerated everything. And so 25 years later, this is what that creek looks like. That is after 4 years of the worst drought in memory, where other ranchers are trucking water in on tankers.
Right.
And here they have all the grass and water that they need, perennial streams and ponds. And it's all about land management. There is no technological magic there. It's just nature magic. And if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. There's a video online of a permaculturist named Jeff Lawton who did this work on the Jordanian desert. And it's just all full of potential. But if you look into the literature to get the scientific perspective on it, you won't find any of this stuff. So that's why...
Is that a failure of narrative, of our ability to tell this story?
It's one of the limitations of the practice of science. And it's nobody's fault, because mostly scientific revolutions happen over a period of decades.
Right.
Unfortunately, at this point, we don't have those decades. So somehow we need to accelerate the process. And we provide a lot of that possibility information, literature in our compendium.
So let me ask you a pragmatic and practical question. How much does it take in terms of funding to do something like what we see here with Susie Creek?
It depends upon where you are. It's obviously going to cost more in the U.S. because of the cost of land.
Right.
Although there's plenty of government land that this could be done on. Susie Creek in northern Nevada, there's lots of government land. So arrangements with ranchers are commonly made where they take their land and adjacent government land and manage it as a unit.
Right, so let's take it a level up. So let's say that the land cost is taken care of. What kind of cost is involved in bringing it to the point where the beavers took over and amplified it?
Mostly it's in getting animals. What happens once you start doing this is that you have to increase your herd size, because the herd that you started with does not keep up with the rapid rate of the growth of the grass.
So you just described the ideal situation for a rancher.
It's a great situation for a rancher, but it's also great for other things around, because in the process of doing this, you have extraordinary increase in biodiversity,
right,
and animal life. So there's a ranch, I think, in Texas where they've been working on this kind of management for years, and so now they have lots of wildlife. So they can charge people to look around the land and go bird watching. They can charge hunters to during hunting season to go shooting, and of course they have their meat that they sell.
And you're describing an environment of prosperity. And,
yes.
and generally, excuse me, we talk about any form of environmental fix as hurting our economy. But what you're describing here adds to it.
It adds to it in more of a local sense,
right,
than the general economy. Although
right.
Certainly meat producers, there are more and more regenerative ranching operations now. And if you go to their websites, you can get their meat if you're within a range of 100 miles or 200 miles or in the region. But very few of them sell nationally.
Well, and that would, of course, increase the carbon load for delivering the meat, reducing the overall value. But localism as a solution here is, this could be a prosperous localism.
It absolutely could be, and it is starting to be in many places. So we have, there are many examples of this kind of abundance and economic success around the world. I work in this arena every day, and I'm constantly discovering new organizations that are doing incredible things, some of them for decades, that I never heard of. Now, I say new, I mean new to me, but they're out there. So in 2008, Paul Hawken wrote a book called Blessed Unrest. And in it, he talks about little pockets of people doing great regenerative things and restoring land and restoring community relationships and economics. And they're all by themselves.
Yeah.
They don't know that they have support and ideas and from other people. And this is one place where the internet has come in as a positive force. And he said in 2008 that we would get to a tipping point. This is a leaderless movement, but we would hit a tipping point where we were communicating with each other and understanding and explaining what to do and helping each other. And we're there. We're at a tipping point. It's just beginning to tip, but we see this is kind of a very positive feedback loop in which one person tells another person who tells another person, and we start amplifying it at each point. People tell lots of other people. And so we are wrestling with the very frightening acceleration of destructive climate phenomena. And at the same time, we have a powerful constructive force that keeps a pace with the destruction, and it's kind of a race. And can we work it so that we actually survive?
Right.
And we've got to do more soon, but it is certainly possible.
Adam, I think this is a great place to end this conversation, but I want to have you come back and talk more. Because you just really brought into clear focus what we've been talking about all through, which is how do you scale the kinds of awareness as well as the ability to collaborate to solve these problems. And that is why we do what we do at Earthland 11, obviously, but it's why so many people are trying to do this. They're waking up to what they see in their own neighborhoods, out over the land they love, seeing the trees that they have always admired or sat under to enjoy the shade die. And
I didn't hear any birds singing this morning.
In our smoke storm that I mentioned earlier, there is no bird song, which is just extraordinary.
Yep.
And normally my yard is full of birds. So thank you very much for joining us on Sustainability in Your Ear, Adam. Tell us, where can we find you online?
We are Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, and our website is Bio for Climate. That's BIO 4climate.org.
Thank you, Adam, very much for joining us. We will be talking to you again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Mitch.
And this is Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earthland 11 podcast. Thanks very much for listening. We'll talk to you the next time.